Our speaker tonight needs very little introduction because of his distinguished reputation, and you know, of course, of his tremendous service to President Ronald Reagan in this country as the National Security Advisor of the President, and the key role he played in the peaceful elimination of the Soviet Union, particularly in creating certain non-kinetic pressures upon that evil empire that brought it down through economic and other measures. So our country owes a great deal to Bud McFarlane. He also served as a counselor to the State Department, a military advisor to Brent Scowcroft and Henry Kissinger. He served for 20 years as a Marine officer. I once made the mistake when I had the privilege of meeting Tom Moynihan, the founder of Domino's Pizza. I said, "Oh, you were a Marine." He looked at me sternly and said, "No, I am a Marine, so I won't make that mistake with you tonight, Bud. He is a Marine." I know there are some other Marines in the audience tonight, so. Now, I won't tell you where Bud McFarlane studied. It's part of the resume you were sent on the email. I just mentioned he has been working hard in recent years in the kind of work out of which he will never run, and that is reconciling Sunni and Shia, reconciling tribes in Darfur. You may have to go back, Bud, on that one. And most recently, working with recently retired 4- and 3-star generals and other senior diplomats on arms control issues in the Middle East, as of course he was a seminal player in arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. So it's something about which he knows a great deal. You know that the first lecture topic we announced might have been considered somewhat anodyne, restoring America's leadership role in the world. It's not that tonight's topic is unrelated to that, but Mr. McFarlane asked if he might be able to switch to this topic on which he will be speaking tonight if conditions allowed him to talk publicly about it. And I'm so glad that conditions have permitted that, and that he will be talking to us tonight on the Sunni response to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action toward MAD or stability. Please join me in welcoming Bud McFarlane.
Thanks to each of you. You have choices, and 68-degree evenings like this, you don't have to be listening to turgid lectures from the over-the-hill gang, so to speak. Your introduction, I noted, was too generous. And in passing, you said early on that I don't need an introduction, but that provoked a memory here about, must have been 2009, as a former staffer for Kissinger, I was asked to organize a reunion of all of the former staffers that had worked for him on the 50th anniversary of when he came to the White House. And so it wasn't a big challenge. Everybody wants to be in the same room with Henry. And so I got everybody together. Everybody came. And because everybody knew him, for goodness sake, he really doesn't need an introduction to that crowd. So I had the bad judgment to essentially use that cliche and say, here's our boss, he needs no introduction, and sit down. Bad choice. Henry got up and he was obviously disappointed, and he said, but I may not need an introduction. but I always enjoy one. That was a blessing to work for Henry. Tonight we're on focusing on a difficult agenda. All of you are well read, follow the news and headlines as you have, an ever more depressing state of mind over the past 10, 15 years, the Middle East. And currently, I bet if someone were to ask you, you could probably name at least 5, probably more, challenges of a seriousness that keeps you awake at night. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but obviously everybody knows about ISIS. Radical Islam has become an acceptable term now, and thanks to Bob Riley, really, if you really want to get beyond the headlines on what is the nature of this menace, he has the definitive book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, which tells you how the rejection of reason, of modernity, occurred, and the Faustian bargain that was reached between the Wahhabist group of wannabe imams back in the middle of the 18th century, but it's undoubtedly the best work anywhere. I would include in that Bernard Lewis's books on the Middle East and Islam. But this is a modern manifestation of this Wahhabist apocalyptic vision, a team, a tribe that believes truly that they are carrying out a mission, a mandate from God to destroy all of the infidels in the world, ending in a caliphate and the end of time. Didn't come here to talk about that tonight, but that is the first challenge that all of us in our country and the West generally face in the Middle East. It's not the only one. Second one that ought to keep you awake at night is Iran. In this country now remaining a revolutionary state since the Ayatollah Khomeini returned in 1979, and has been since that time on a theocratic crusade, first to expel all Western influence from the Middle East, and then gradually, directly and through the use of surrogates like Hezbollah, to dominate the Middle East and ultimately the world as the leader of Islam. Iran, of course, being Shia, and about 15% globally of the Muslim faith, but now well-funded, well-trained, well-armed, well-advanced in using surrogates and directly to expel our presence from the Middle East and ultimately to outflank the Sunni dominant populations of the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia, all of the Gulf cooperation countries, Egypt, Jordan, and North Africa. The third challenge, equally daunting, and it turns on the intervention of Russia into the Middle East. This is the first time they have been able to establish a presence with a host country, Syria, welcoming them. small footnote, if you'd indulge me. Russia for years has wanted to break out of the relative isolation as a great power, as a global power, that stems from their not having access to the oceans of the world except through Vladivostok, and having to come through the Dardanelles, Turkish-controlled straits that prevent easy in and out access, given the Montreux Convention, which gives Turkey sovereign control over in and out there. In 1958, I was still in college. President Eisenhower recognized the probes and attempts here and there. The Soviet Union in those days were trying to establish access to open waters and would go to great lengths to try to subvert governments that had a presence on a major strait or on an ocean, to grant them basing rights and so forth. And at the time, in 58, they were trying to subvert one of the political parties of Lebanon, and thereby, once it was in power, to have a port on the Mediterranean and be able to contest what had been an American lake for all of the post-war period. Well, President Eisenhower, no slouch at grand strategy, could see that intention and how far it had advanced, and the readiness even of Soviet forces to back up this party in Lebanon. At the time, I was having my 21st birthday, and we were tied up on an aircraft carrier called the Essex in Greece, Piraeus. Well, on my 21st birthday, I was determined to have 21 drinks, and unfortunately I did, and so I didn't go on liberty the next night. But half the Liberty Party was ashore, and I was recovering. And in the middle of the night, there was a general quarters. It doesn't usually happen when you're tied up to a pier in some port. But the direction had come from the White House to the Sixth Fleet and to the Essex to lead a battle group to Lebanon and land a battalion of Marines tomorrow morning. So we singled up all lines, pulled out of Piraeus, were on our way, and did indeed land Marines the next morning and prevented the Soviet Union. Well, I mentioned that, not that it was heroic, it wasn't, but it was how some presidents really can identify, thank you, strategic purpose of great powers, China, Russia, in earlier days, Great Britain and the United States. Decisive leadership. Well, Russia has come into Syria, going back 2 years now, with the same goal in mind: establish a presence, a basing presence that you can use to project power today into the Mediterranean, but of course through Suez and all into the Indian Ocean, the Far East, and the West as well. In addition to that foothold that they've established in Syria, propping up this government there and assuring that it will be there to be the arbitrator of Syria's leadership and its position in the Middle East. I promise this will go away in a minute. But Russia also has the capability to establish influence over governments here and there by virtue of its ability to sell weapons. And this relates to many countries, but today in Iran, the ability to deliver state-of-the-art air, ground, naval vessels and so forth, and nuclear power generation. has enabled them to ingratiate themselves to Iran. And if you look at a map or picture it in your minds, if you're Russia and the Middle East, and you have an established foothold in Syria on the western edge, and in Iran, you really are within reach of changing a balance of power in the Middle East that has endured for 72 years. And I use that number because 72 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt concluded an agreement with the King of Saudi Arabia in which he pledged to provide security for the entire region in perpetuity, forever. So important was the repository of most of the oil in the world. Today, the OPEC cartel owns about 70% of all the oil in the ground, and that's notwithstanding all of the fracking. Canada, Mexico, the United States, other sources are dwarfed by the oil holdings of OPEC. Well, why should we care? Well, we should care because the United States needs markets. And when you look around the world, where are those markets? Well, they're China, Japan, Korea, all of East Asia, as well as Europe. And all of those countries rely on the Middle East for oil, on OPEC. And so it's important to us, to our self-interest and prosperity, that we have access to Japan, Korea, Europe, and so forth. And today, thanks to this Russian presence and prevailing influence on Iran, Syria, and pretty soon, much of the rest of the Middle East is important to us. But that's the third issue that we really ought to care about. Fourth challenge that is on our agenda turns on the socioeconomic horror, really, that's unfolding as people flee Syria. So far, on the order of 9 million people. 9 million people having to leave, being forced to leave, after huge losses. 400,000 of them have made it thus far to Europe. And predictably, within those 400,000, there are Wahhabist, radical Islamist people schooled by ISIS and ready to do harm. And they have, haven't they? In Paris, in November of 2015, coordinated attacks at 6 locations made it possible to kill 130 people. And later, a driver in Nice. Later, terrorists in Brussels, airports, and San Bernardino, Florida. So this menace is not something that we can say we are protected by oceans. Not anymore. A lot of challenges. Well, in case you were to a point where you were going to say, well, I can imagine solutions to those. Those are pretty easy. Let me give you a fifth one. The fifth one derives from the agreement that was concluded 2 years ago now between Iran and 5 countries, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, China, France, and Germany, concluded an agreement that sought to put restrictions upon the Iranian nuclear power generation program, a program that had been a cover already with solid American intelligence identifying efforts to create a nuclear weapons program by diverting nuclear fuel to weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium. Well, this program, whatever you may think of it, and people that I respect argue both sides of whether it was good, did it work, is it working or not. One thing is clear, and that is that it has stimulated a lust by every other Muslim country in the region, the Sunnis notably, who view Iran as their heretic in their judgment, but their threat, their enemy, because Iran tells you that without hesitation, that it intends to expel Western influence, then overcome the Sunni infidel countries, and ultimately dominate the Middle East. So you have Saudi Arabia and all of the countries in the Persian Gulf seeking to obtain nuclear power generation, or at least that is the stated goal. But they're looking across the Persian Gulf at a nuclear weapons program. They are confident of that. They don't believe this agreement is going to be enforceable, verifiable, and that they had better get on their way to be competitive. Equally predictable, Russia and China, who have very robust industries, nuclear power industries, have rushed to the area and have offered to build nuclear power plants for Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates, as well as Egypt and Jordan, 6 countries, and already have put on paper memoranda of understanding or letters of intent where Russia is committing to build these plants, dozens of nuclear power plants in the Sunni Arab side. Well, you don't have to be Kissinger to see the potential of what could happen here. If you have a nuclear arms race in which Sunni Arab community is competing to see who can develop the both warheads as well as delivery systems, and it's a recipe, well, Henry Kissinger, when we met with him, my team that I'll tell you about in a minute, that will have mutual assured destruction within 10 years. That refers to the mad doctrine, and I won't bore you with that, but that's what happens when countries seeing a competitor concludes that it can destroy the weapons of the competitor with a first strike. And of course, that sets off uncontrollable exchange of nuclear weapons. Nobody wants that. Well, how do you cope with an issue like that? Especially if you're in the unfortunate position of the United States right now, where, notwithstanding Franklin Roosevelt's commitment to secure all of the Middle East, all of the Arab states view that we have betrayed them and thrown that 72-year record and commitment down the drain, and they don't believe that they can trust us anymore. Well, understandably, many Americans are inclined to say, well, why should we care? We have all the oil we need. But the truth is that we should care because all of us are at risk if there is a nuclear conflict anywhere, let alone all those markets I mentioned before of countries who are affected by oil coming out of the Middle East and which would clearly be disrupted. So what do you do about it? being able to commit to all of these Arab states that we can do what Russia can do. We can do what China could do in building nuclear power plants for you. But we would come with control measures that would insist upon the fuel cycle being ironclad, that it could not be diverted to a weapons program, because the United States wants to control it. Well, there really are ways to do that. It's why the United Nations has this organization in Vienna that is supposed to go and monitor any country that has any kind of nuclear power program. And that's good guys, bad guys from Russia, Japan, and every other country. And there are dozens and dozens that do have nuclear power generation programs. But it involves important measures and technology, because you're really talking about going to dozens of plants, delivering fuel, first making the fuel, taking it there, overseeing the operation of the plant, and when the fuel is depleted, recovering it and making sure that it doesn't go back into reprocessing, usable again for weapons. So it's not a trivial undertaking. Similarly, when you stop to think about, well, who might threaten a nuclear power plant? Well, there are no end of candidates in the Middle East. ISIS, Iran. But the point is, you really have to go there not just to deliver fuel and oversee the operation of a power plant. You better have pretty good intelligence. You have better be able to know. What is ISIS up to? Better still, why not destroy ISIS before you go? That's no Sunday afternoon walk in the park. It is feasible. General Jack Keane is a member of our team, and if you have the interest in what operations ought to be undertaken here in the next couple of years to roll back this menace, he has given testimony on the Hill. It's easily accessible. If you Google General Jack Keane, it will come up. And it explains a very plausible, sensible, tried and true strategy for going after ISIS forces in Syria and Iraq. And done properly, it can be done. We have done it in the past to a point, but then we pulled the plug on the conflict back in 2012 before we had finished. Well, let me try to constrict what I've said thus far down to kind of the nexus of the crisis we've got to deal with in the next year's time. First of all, you have Russia, a great power, with massive nuclear power as well as conventional forces, and it is on the ground in the Middle East, astride 70% of the oil of the world. Second, you have Iran with a declaratory policy of bringing down Western influence in the Middle East, and having demonstrated already with direct use of Iranian forces killing American forces in Iraq, and in addition to the Revolutionary Guard Corps, this very, very well-trained, well-funded Iranian military force, relying on surrogates, notably Hezbollah in Lebanon, that has been very, very active in Syria, propping up the Assad regime, but in behalf of Iran, ultimately to enable Iran to establish this arc that outflanks the Sunni countries, the entire Arabian Peninsula. So you have Russia on the one hand, you have Iran determined to overcome governance and disrupt the Sunni Muslim community of nations. Finally, there is good news, though, with the third element that I want to spend a little time on. And the good news is that in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates, Egypt, Jordan, all in all, in the order of 300 million people, Sunni Arabs, there has been the beginning of an awakening that their stability is very much at risk. Yes, from Iran, of course, but also from their own dysfunction. These monarchies they have always thought, the blessing of living off a predictable, reliable resource, oil, that the whole world needs, and they have most of it, and so their future is assured. But now that they have begun to think hard about, is it really going to last forever? And Americans, McKinsey, a well-known consulting firm, has gone there in considerable strength at Saudi request and has pointed out, this really is finite, your oil, and you're not using it very well. For one thing, you're using it to generate electricity, and that's oil that you can't sell. You're using it on yourself. So better that you hold on to it, because in the bottom line, McKinsey told Saudi Arabia, you are going to be importing oil, if you keep on the way you are, by the late 2030s. That's not far away. And it has really concentrated the mind of the leadership of Saudi Arabia. The king right now is 81-year-old King Salman, but it is his son, a man named Mohammed bin Salman, 32 years old, Western educated, very bright, thoughtful person who has dealt with those facts. But right now, we have several problems. The oil is going to run out. We're wasting it by using it to generate electricity. However, the bigger problem is we have a population that has been largely on the dole, and it's expensive. And worse, when they go off to school and they come back and there are no jobs, there is no career path. If any of you, when you were children, were going to pursue the American dream and you managed to find a way to go off to school and get an education, you did it because you had a way. There were jobs available, not in Saudi Arabia. And so this Deputy Crown Prince has had the good sense to say, our country must industrialize. We have to begin doing things that other countries do routinely, like feed ourselves. We have to develop agriculture. It takes a lot of water. That has to be desalinated. Why aren't we making pharmaceuticals? Other countries make quite a lot of money. Everything from fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals. In short, this young 31-year-old has developed a plan. It's called Vision 2030. And it calls for the industrialization of the country, moving away from exclusive reliance on oil, and instead, by generating electricity by other means. Well, how do you do that? Well, there are a lot of them, and up until now, for about 4 or 5 years, they've been relying upon renewables. Well, there's a lot of sun in Saudi Arabia. That makes sense. Wind, yes, that makes sense. But when you add all of those up, and again, McKinsey, their consultants have gone through the very detailed calculation of, could you really make enough electricity using solar and wind to desalinate enough water to become an agricultural country? And they've concluded, no, it really doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of how much electricity you need. Desalination of salt water is a very power-intensive, electricity-intensive process. And the bottom line is, the only way you're ever going to be able to generate enough electricity to begin to do any of these things, whether it's agriculture, pharmaceuticals, or anything else, is with nuclear power. So, it's good news that you have these enlightened next generation rulers finally seeing that being kind of dictator monarchs isn't going to work anymore. And if you want to have a vibrant society that has career paths that are predictable to the next generation of kids coming along, you'd better identify, what could we do? What could we make? How do we do it? Their blessing, of course, is they do have the money in the bank. If you've got $750 billion in your central bank, you could finance a lot of things. And if you have an oil company that goes public with only 5% of Aramco, the Saudi oil company, being offered for public investment, you make a lot of money on that IPO. Trillions of dollars. So it's not a matter of not having the cash. And now that they've decided they're going to use it in a sensible fashion, well, so you have three pieces to this thread. Russia, very ambitious in trying to co-opt the Arab steppes with power plants that aren't necessarily going to have the strict control over the diversion of nuclear fuel. Iran, sworn enemy across the Gulf, anxious, of course, to prevent them doing what Iran has done. And the United States not anywhere to be seen. And worse, very few people in America have been kind of challenged to think about that. And as the election showed here back in November, because we do have fracking and a lot of oil, there's going to be a very reluctant sentiment throughout our country. Why in the world should we do this? Well, I've tried to give you a sense of why it is terribly important and that it really can be done. It isn't going to get done by fasting and prayer, though, I'll tell you. It's going to take a great deal of concentration, rallying American corporations, and here you begin to see that there really is an upside for the United States. What I mean by that is that today, it really would be irresponsible to go to Saudi Arabia, build a power plant, and turn it over to Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's not disparaging. It just takes a little bit of study, time, and effort to learn how to be a nuclear engineer. And so our country could, and get paid for, bringing young Saudis here to go to any of our about 100 nuclear power plants and under contract and careful tutoring, spend a year here and figuring out how do you do this. Now this wouldn't be a kind of a whimsical operation that you just invite them here, hold classes like in a room like this and send them back, best wishes. No. We would also have to be there on site, coaching, and really doing it ourselves for up to 5 years. And we would have to secure those plants, and we would have to put into orbit satellites that would collect sufficient intelligence to be able to be confident that you are not going to be hit by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or anybody else. But if there is another piece of good news, it is that in talks already taking place, there is this awakening. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, the Emirates, that they really need help. And it comes down to whether or not it's better to come from the United States or from Russia, China. And because historically we have been a reliable ally for that part of the world, they've stepped up to the bottom line issues in this whole scenario and said, we'll pay for it. So I don't mean to make this sound easy, it's certainly not easy, but at least it is something that can be done to enable the United States to restore stability into the Middle East region without costing taxpayers money to do that, and have some confidence then that the oil to East Asia and Europe and Africa is not going to be disrupted by Russia or anybody else. That there will be a balance of power again that hasn't been there for the past 8 or 15 years, really. So those are things that I'm afraid may keep you awake at night.